The strategic situation on the Eastern Front by autumn 1942 had reached a critical juncture for both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The Wehrmacht's summer offensive, Operation Case Blue, had advanced deep into the Caucasus while simultaneously besieging Stalingrad on the Volga River. German forces controlled territory extending from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, occupying an area containing 88 million Soviet citizens and critical industrial regions. However, this apparent German success masked growing vulnerabilities in an overextended front line stretching across 3,000 kilometers. The Rzhev salient, positioned 230 kilometers west of Moscow, represented one of the most threatening German positions on the entire Eastern Front. This bulge in Soviet defensive lines extended 160 kilometers westward from the main German positions, creating a dangerous spearhead aimed directly at the Soviet capital. German Army Group Center's 9th Army, commanded by Colonel General Walter Model, occupied fortified positions throughout the salient, with approximately 370,000 troops supported by 600 tanks and 8,000 artillery pieces. Soviet strategic planning during this period reflected Joseph Stalin's determination to maintain pressure on German forces across multiple sectors while preventing Wehrmacht reinforcements from reaching Stalingrad. The Soviet High Command, known as Stavka, developed parallel offensive operations designed to exploit perceived German weaknesses. While Operation Uranus targeted German positions around Stalingrad, a simultaneous offensive against the Rzhev salient promised to eliminate the direct threat to Moscow while potentially destroying an entire German army. The Soviet Union's military position had improved dramatically since the desperate months of 1941. Red Army strength had grown to approximately 6.1 million active personnel, supported by 7,250 tanks and 77,800 artillery pieces. Industrial production had relocated beyond German reach to the Urals and Siberia, generating increasing quantities of modern equipment including T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and improved aircraft. Soviet commanders had gained combat experience while developing tactical innovations adapted to German methods. German intelligence assessments during autumn 1942 identified growing Soviet offensive capabilities, but failed to anticipate the scale of planned operations. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated Soviet reserves at approximately 25% below actual strength, while underestimating the speed of Red Army mobilization and equipment production. German commanders in the Rzhev salient reported increasing Soviet probing attacks and reconnaissance activity, but interpreted these as defensive preparations rather than offensive preparations. The international context of autumn 1942 created additional pressures on both Soviet and German strategic planning. The Anglo-American invasion of North Africa, launched on November 8, 1942, opened a second front that threatened to drain German resources from the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, Soviet diplomatic relations with Britain and the United States had strengthened through Lend-Lease aid deliveries, totaling 2.3 million tons of supplies by November 1942. These international developments influenced Stalin's calculations about the timing and scale of winter offensive operations. Soviet public sentiment during this period reflected a complex mixture of determination and exhaustion after 16 months of devastating warfare. Civilian casualties had reached approximately 13.7 million by autumn 1942, while industrial cities in occupied territories faced systematic destruction. However, successful Soviet resistance at Stalingrad and other sectors had demonstrated that German forces could be defeated, creating growing confidence in eventual victory among both military personnel and civilians. The German public remained largely ignorant of the true strategic situation on the Eastern Front due to propaganda emphasizing victories while minimizing losses. Official casualty reports understated German military deaths, which had reached approximately 750,000 by November 1942. Wehrmacht morale in the Rzhev salient reflected the strain of prolonged defensive operations against increasing Soviet pressure, with reports of declining effectiveness among some units due to combat fatigue and supply difficulties. Military preparedness on both sides reflected the accumulated experience of extended combat operations. Soviet forces had developed improved coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery units while incorporating lessons learned from previous offensive failures. German defensive positions in the Rzhev salient featured elaborate fortifications including concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire designed to maximize the effectiveness of available troops against numerically superior Soviet forces. The strategic balance in the Rzhev sector favored Soviet forces in terms of numerical superiority, but German forces retained advantages in defensive positioning, equipment quality, and tactical experience. Soviet intelligence estimated that successful elimination of the salient would require approximately 667,000 troops, supported by 1,900 tanks and 24,000 artillery pieces. German defensive preparations had transformed the salient into what military analysts described as the most heavily fortified position on the Eastern Front outside of major urban centers. The approaching winter of 1942-1943 created additional considerations for both sides. Historical precedent suggested that cold weather favored Soviet forces adapted to harsh conditions, while German equipment and personnel faced challenges maintaining effectiveness in extreme temperatures. However, German positions in the Rzhev salient included substantial fortifications designed to provide protection during winter months, potentially offsetting some traditional Soviet advantages. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation that would test both sides' capabilities while determining the strategic balance on the critical Moscow axis of the Eastern Front. The opening phase of Operation Mars commenced at 0730 hours on November 25, 1942, with a massive artillery barrage involving 3,300 guns and mortars from the Soviet Western and Kalinin fronts. This bombardment, lasting 80 minutes, targeted German forward positions across a 200-kilometer front extending from Velikie Luki in the north to Sychevka in the south. The concentration of artillery fire exceeded 100 guns per kilometer in key sectors, representing one of the most intensive preparatory bombardments attempted by Soviet forces to that point in the war. Marshal Georgy Zhukov coordinated the offensive from his headquarters near Kalinin, commanding a force totaling 667,000 troops organized into 46 rifle divisions, 8 tank brigades, and supporting units. The Western Front, under Colonel General Ivan Konev, deployed 334,000 personnel with the mission of capturing Sychevka and breaking through German defenses south of the salient. The Kalinin Front, commanded by Colonel General Maxim Purkayev, committed 333,000 troops to operations north of Rzhev, aimed at capturing Olenino and Bely. German forces in the Rzhev salient detected Soviet preparations through increased reconnaissance activity and prisoner interrogations during the weeks preceding the offensive. Colonel General Walter Model, commanding the Ninth Army, had strengthened defensive positions while requesting additional reserves from Army Group Center. However, competing demands from the Stalingrad sector limited available reinforcements, leaving German defenders to face overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority with existing resources. The initial Soviet assault achieved tactical surprise despite German awareness of offensive preparations. Red Army units broke through German forward positions at multiple points, advancing up to 8 kilometers in some sectors during the first day. The 6th Tank Corps penetrated German defenses near Vazuza, while the 1st Guards Tank Corps achieved breakthroughs south of Belai. These initial successes suggested that Soviet forces might achieve their ambitious objective of encircling and destroying the entire Ninth Army within the projected time frame. However, German defensive reactions proved more effective than Soviet planners had anticipated. Model implemented immediate counterattack measures using reserve formations positioned in depth behind the main defensive line. The 9th Panzer Division and 1st Panzer Division conducted coordinated counterstrokes that contained Soviet penetrations while inflicting severe casualties on Red Army spearhead units. German anti-tank defenses proved particularly effective against Soviet armor advancing across open terrain without adequate infantry support. Weather conditions during the opening phase created additional challenges for both sides. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, while heavy snowfall reduced visibility and complicated movement of wheeled vehicles. Soviet logistics suffered as supply columns struggled to maintain contact with advancing units, while German defenders benefited from prepared positions offering protection from harsh conditions. The extreme weather negated some Soviet advantages while enhancing the effectiveness of German defensive preparations. Soviet command decisions during the opening phase reflected overconfidence about German defensive capabilities and underestimation of the time required to achieve breakthrough operations. Zhukov ordered continued attacks despite mounting casualties, believing that sustained pressure would eventually overwhelm German resistance. The commitment of reserve formations earlier than planned indicated Soviet awareness that initial objectives were not being achieved according to schedule. Key tactical engagements during November 25-27 demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Soviet offensive capabilities. The capture of several German strongpoints suggested that Red Army units had improved their assault techniques, while German defensive success at other locations indicated that Wehrmacht forces retained significant combat effectiveness. Casualty ratios during these initial encounters approximated 3.1 in favor of German forces, reflecting the advantages of prepared defensive positions. The German High Command's response to Operation Mars revealed competing priorities within Wehrmacht strategic planning. While recognizing the serious threat to Army Group Center, German leadership remained committed to offensive operations at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus. Limited reserves available for reinforcing the Ninth Army reflected broader German strategic overextension across the Eastern Front. However, the critical importance of maintaining positions near Moscow ensured that available reserves were committed to defending the Rzhev salient. Intelligence assessments during the opening phase provided both sides with incomplete pictures of enemy capabilities and intentions. Soviet commanders overestimated the extent of initial breakthroughs while underestimating German reserve strength. German intelligence correctly identified the scale of Soviet offensive preparations, but failed to anticipate the coordination between multiple Soviet fronts. These intelligence failures contributed to tactical miscalculations that would influence the entire operation's development. Civilian populations in the combat zone faced immediate displacement as military operations intensified. Approximately 25,000 Soviet civilians remained in German-occupied villages within the salient, while partisan units operated behind German lines throughout the region. The expansion of combat operations threatened these populations, while creating additional challenges for both military forces attempting to maintain security in rear areas during intensive offensive and defensive operations. The first 3 days of Operation Mars established patterns that would characterize the entire offensive. Soviet numerical superiority enabled tactical breakthroughs, German defensive skill contained major penetrations, and extreme weather conditions complicated operations for both sides. The stage was set for a prolonged and costly battle that would test the limits of both Soviet offensive capabilities and German defensive resilience on one of the most critical sectors of the Eastern Front. Soviet strategic planning for Operation Mars evolved throughout November 1942 as Stavka refined objectives and allocated resources between competing offensive priorities. Marshal Zhukov's initial proposal envisioned a double envelopment of the Rzhev salient through coordinated attacks from north and south, aiming to trap the entire German Ninth Army in a massive pocket. This ambitious plan required precise timing and coordination between multiple Soviet fronts while maintaining sufficient reserves to exploit anticipated breakthroughs. The Western Front's assault plan called for breakthrough operations along 3 primary axes converging on the town of Sychevka. General Konev deployed the 20th Army with 86,000 personnel against German positions near Rzhev itself, while the 31st Army with 72,000 troops targeted defenses around Vazuza. The 29th Army, numbering 64,000 soldiers, received orders to advance toward Sychevka from the southeast. These coordinated attacks aimed to fragment German defensive lines while creating opportunities for armor exploitation. The Kalinin Front's operations focused on eliminating German strongpoints north of the salient through concentrated assaults against Bely and Olenino. General Purkayev committed the 41st Army with 95,000 personnel to capture Bely, while the 22nd Army, deploying 84,000 troops, received orders to advance on Olenino. The 3rd Shock Army, totaling 78,000 soldiers, would provide flank protection and exploit breakthrough opportunities as they developed during the offensive. German defensive preparations under Colonel General Model reflected sophisticated understanding of Soviet offensive tactics developed through 18 months of Eastern Front combat experience. The 9th Army organized defense in depth, utilizing natural terrain features, supplemented by extensive field fortifications. Forward positions included 2,400 concrete bunkers connected by communication trenches extending 45 kilometers behind the main battle line. Anti-tank obstacles covered probable Soviet armor approaches with 34,000 mines deployed across critical sectors. The distribution of German forces within the salient demonstrated Model's emphasis on mobile defense, utilizing concentrated reserves. The WW2 Army Corps, with 67,000 troops, defended the northern sector around Olenino, while the Expeditionären Panzer Corps, deploying 58,000 personnel, held positions near Sikhevka. The 6th Army Corps, numbering 71,000 soldiers, maintained defensive lines directly threatening Moscow from the eastern portion of the salient. Reserve formations, including the 1st Panzer Division and 9th Panzer Division, totaled 45,000 troops positioned for rapid counterattack operations. Soviet intelligence assessments preceding Operation Mars contained significant gaps regarding German defensive strength and capabilities. Red Army reconnaissance estimated German troop strength at approximately 280,000 personnel, understating actual numbers by 90,000. Soviet planners also underestimated German artillery concentrations, calculating 5,200 guns and mortars compared to the actual total of 8,000 pieces. These intelligence failures would prove crucial as Soviet forces encountered stronger resistance than anticipated. Logistical preparations for Operation Mars required moving massive quantities of supplies forward to support the largest Soviet offensive operation attempted since the German invasion. Soviet supply units transported 2.4 million artillery shells, 180,000 tons of fuel, and 290,000 tons of food supplies to forward depots during the 3 weeks preceding the attack. The Western and Kalinin fronts established 47 ammunition dumps and 23 fuel storage facilities within 30 kilometers of the front line. German logistical arrangements emphasized ammunition conservation and defensive sustainability rather than offensive preparations. The 9th Army maintained artillery ammunition reserves totaling 1.1 million rounds, distributed among fortified positions throughout the salient. Fuel supplies remained adequate for defensive operations, but insufficient for sustained mobile warfare. Medical facilities included 12 hospitals with capacity for 8,400 casualties, reflecting German expectations of intense defensive combat. Weather intelligence indicated that Operation Mars would commence during the traditional Russian winter campaign season, when harsh conditions historically favored Soviet forces. Meteorological services predicted temperatures dropping to minus 25 degrees Celsius, with heavy snowfall beginning in early December. Soviet planners calculated that winter conditions would limit German mobility, while Red Army units equipped for cold weather operations retained tactical flexibility. The timing of Operation Mars reflected Stalin's strategic vision of simultaneous offensives designed to prevent German commanders from shifting reserves between threatened sectors. While Operation Uranus targeted Stalingrad beginning November 19th, Operation Mars would commence 6 days later to exploit German strategic confusion and resource constraints. This coordination aimed to maximize Soviet advantages while minimizing German defensive capabilities across the entire Eastern Front. Soviet propaganda preparation for Operation Mars emphasized the patriotic significance of eliminating direct threats to Moscow while portraying the operation as decisive action toward ultimate victory. Red Army political officers conducted intensive sessions emphasizing the historical importance of defending the capital from fascist occupation. These efforts aimed to maximize troop morale while justifying the anticipated casualties required for breakthrough operations against fortified German positions. German intelligence services detected extensive Soviet preparations during November, but failed to anticipate the precise timing and scale of Operation Mars. Wehrmacht reconnaissance flights documented Soviet troop concentrations and supply movements, but underestimated the offensive potential of observed forces. German commanders interpreted Soviet activities as defensive improvements rather than preparation for major offensive operations against the salient. Command relationships within the Soviet force structure created potential coordination challenges that German planners hoped to exploit. The Western and Kalinin fronts operated under separate command authorities with limited integration of operational planning. Communication difficulties between front headquarters and subordinate armies could create gaps in coordination that German defensive tactics might exploit through rapid counterattack operations against isolated Soviet penetrations. Reserve allocation decisions reflected competing priorities within both Soviet and German strategic planning. Zhukov retained substantial reserves, including the 6th Tank Corps with 12,000 personnel and 180 tanks for exploitation operations once breakthrough occurred. German reserves remained limited due to commitments elsewhere, though Model maintained the equivalent of 2 divisions in mobile reserve positions capable of rapid deployment against Soviet penetrations throughout the salient. The final preparations for Operation Mars concluded on November 24, 1942, as Soviet artillery units moved into firing positions while German defenders completed last-minute improvements to defensive installations. Both sides understood that the approaching battle would determine control over one of the most strategically significant sectors of the Eastern Front, with implications extending far beyond the immediate tactical situation around Rzhev and Moscow. The strategic objectives of Operation Mars reflected Soviet ambitions to achieve decisive victory on the Moscow axis while simultaneously supporting operations around Stalingrad. Stavka's directives called for the complete destruction of German Army Group Center's 9th Army through coordinated envelopment operations, potentially eliminating 370,000 German troops and creating a 160-kilometer gap in Wehrmacht defensive lines. This ambitious goal required Soviet forces to advance 80 kilometers westward while maintaining coordination between multiple armies operating across difficult terrain in winter conditions. Marshal Zhukov's operational planning divided the offensive into 3 distinct phases designed to achieve progressive destruction of German defensive capabilities. Phase 1 called for breakthrough operations lasting 4 days, eliminating German forward positions and advancing 25 kilometers into the salient. Phase 2 envisioned exploitation operations over 6 days, with Soviet armor advancing to cut German supply lines while encircling major defensive positions. Phase 3 planned the systematic elimination of trapped German forces within 8 days, completing the destruction of the 9th Army. German defensive doctrine under Colonel General Model emphasized flexible response, utilizing prepared positions to channel Soviet attacks into killing zones covered by concentrated artillery and anti-tank fire. The 9th Army's defensive concept relied on absorbing initial Soviet assaults while preserving mobile reserves for decisive counterattacks against overextended Red Army spearheads. German planners calculated that inflicting casualty ratios of 4.1 against attacking Soviet forces would eventually exhaust Red Army offensive capabilities regardless of initial numerical advantages. Soviet logistical planning for Operation Mars required unprecedented coordination to sustain 667,000 troops, plus supporting equipment across multiple supply lines extending up to 180 kilometers from railroad terminals. The Western Front established 23 supply routes capable of transporting 12,000 tons of materials daily, while the Kalinin Front organized 18 routes with capacity for 9,500 tons per day. Soviet quartermasters calculated requirements of 840 tons of ammunition, 320 tons of fuel, and 950 tons of food supplies daily during active operations. German supply arrangements emphasized defensive sustainability rather than offensive operations, with the 9th Army receiving allocations designed to support prolonged defensive combat. Wehrmacht logistics maintained stockpiles of 45 days ammunition, 30 days fuel, and 60 days food supplies distributed among fortified positions throughout the salient. German supply lines extended 290 kilometers to major railroad terminals, creating vulnerability to Soviet interdiction operations but providing adequate capacity for defensive requirements. Artillery preparation for Operation Mars involved concentrating 3,375 guns and mortars from both fronts, achieving densities of 158 pieces per kilometer along breakthrough sectors. Soviet artillery plans called for 80-minute preparatory bombardments, followed by rolling barrages advancing at rates of 100 meters per 4 minutes to support infantry assaults. Counter-battery missions targeted 847 identified German artillery positions with the objective of neutralizing 60% of enemy fire support capabilities during initial breakthrough operations. German counter-artillery preparations relied on 682 guns positioned in concealed firing positions with predetermined defensive fire missions covering probable Soviet attack routes. Wehrmacht artillery doctrine emphasized concentrated fires against Soviet assembly areas and breakthrough points rather than sustained counter-battery operations. German gunners maintained ammunition reserves totaling 180,000 rounds, sufficient for 12 days of intensive defensive fire support operations. Soviet armor allocation provided each breakthrough army with tank support averaging 47 vehicles per division, totaling 1,890 tanks distributed across both fronts. The 6th Tank Corps, with 212 tanks, received missions to exploit Western Front breakthroughs toward Sychevka, while the 3rd Mechanized Corps, deploying 186 tanks, would advance through Kalinin Front penetrations toward Belly. Soviet armor tactics emphasized rapid exploitation following infantry breakthrough rather than direct assault against prepared positions. German anti-tank defenses incorporated 340 towed guns and 89 self-propelled weapons positioned in depth throughout the salient's defensive zones. Wehrmacht anti-tank planning relied on channeling Soviet armor into engagement areas covered by multiple weapon systems while utilizing natural obstacles and minefields to restrict enemy mobility. German defenders had in place 34,000 anti-tank mines across probable Soviet armor approaches, creating defensive barriers requiring extensive engineering support to overcome. Air support planning revealed significant disparities between Soviet and German aviation capabilities in the Rzhev sector. The Red Air Force allocated 1 E-100 aircraft to support Operation Mars, including 320 fighters, 580 ground attack aircraft, and 200 bombers. German air support consisted of 290 aircraft from Luftflotte 1, including 125 fighters, 95 dive bombers, and 70 reconnaissance planes. Soviet numerical superiority promised air supremacy during breakthrough operations if weather conditions permitted sustained flight operations. Intelligence preparation focused on identifying German defensive weaknesses while concealing Soviet offensive preparations from Wehrmacht reconnaissance. Red Army intelligence estimated German artillery positions, communication centers, and reserve locations through prisoner interrogations and reconnaissance missions. Soviet deception operations included false radio traffic, dummy installations, and diversionary attacks designed to obscure the actual timing and objectives of Operation Mars. German intelligence efforts concentrated on determining Soviet offensive capabilities and probable attack sectors through signal intercepts and aerial reconnaissance. Wehrmacht intelligence correctly identified major Soviet troop concentrations, but underestimated their offensive potential and coordination between fronts. German assessments predicted Soviet attacks limited to local objectives rather than the comprehensive offensive actually planned by Stavka. Propaganda preparation aimed to maximize troop morale while minimizing adverse reactions to anticipated heavy casualties. Soviet political officers emphasized the historic significance of eliminating threats to Moscow while portraying Operation Mars as decisive action toward final victory. German propaganda stressed defensive mission importance while preparing units for prolonged resistance against numerically superior Soviet forces attacking fortified positions. Medical preparations reflected both sides' expectations of intensive combat with substantial casualties. Soviet medical services established 34 hospitals with capacity for 18,500 casualties within 50 kilometers of the front line, while organizing 127 mobile surgical teams for forward treatment. German medical facilities included 12 hospitals, accommodating 8,400 patients, supplemented by evacuation capabilities designed to transport serious casualties to rear area hospitals beyond Soviet artillery range. The final operational preparations concluded with detailed briefings for unit commanders on November 24, 1942, as both sides completed arrangements for the decisive battle that would determine control over the strategically crucial Rzhev salient and influence broader Eastern Front operations throughout the coming winter campaign season. The first engagement of Operation Mars erupted at 0730 hours on November 25, 1942, as Soviet artillery commenced the most intensive preparatory bombardment attempted by Red Army forces since the German invasion. The 80-minute barrage involved 3,775 guns, firing 67,000 rounds against German positions across a 200-kilometer front, with shell concentrations reaching 158 pieces per kilometer in breakthrough sectors. German defenders reported that the bombardment intensity exceeded anything experienced during previous Soviet offensives, creating widespread destruction of forward positions and communication systems. Soviet infantry assaults began at 8:50 hours following the artillery preparation, with 46 rifle divisions attacking simultaneously across multiple sectors of the salient. The 20th Army's assault near Rzhev achieved initial penetrations of 3 kilometers against the German 161st Infantry Division, while the 31st Army advanced 5 kilometers through positions held by the 102nd Infantry Division near Vazuza. These early breakthroughs suggested that Soviet forces might achieve their ambitious timetable for eliminating German resistance within the projected time frame. German defensive reactions proved more resilient than Soviet planners had anticipated. Colonel General Model implemented immediate counterattack procedures using the 1st Panzer Division against Soviet penetrations near Sychevka, while the 9th Panzer Division responded to breakthrough attempts around Bailey. These mobile reserves, totaling 187 tanks and 23,000 personnel, contained initial Soviet advances while inflicting casualty ratios approximating 3.5.1 in favor of German forces during the first day of operations. Weather conditions during the opening engagements created unexpected challenges for both attacking and defending forces. Temperatures dropped to minus 18 degrees Celsius, while heavy snowfall reduced visibility to less than 200 meters across most combat sectors. Soviet infantry found that snow depths averaging 35 centimeters impeded movement while exposing attacking units to German defensive fire. German defenders benefited from prepared positions, but faced difficulties with frozen weapons and equipment malfunctions in extreme cold. The 41st Army's assault against Belly represented one of the most successful Soviet breakthrough attempts during the first day. Lieutenant General Tarasov's forces penetrated German positions held by the 246th Infantry Division, advancing 6 kilometers while capturing 340 prisoners and destroying 23 German tanks. However, the 9th Panzer Division's counterattack at 1430 hours recaptured most lost territory while inflicting 2,800 casualties on the attacking 150th Rifle Division. Soviet armor commitment during the initial engagements revealed coordination problems between tank and infantry units operating in difficult terrain conditions. The 6th Tank Corps lost 47 vehicles during breakthrough attempts near Vazuza, primarily to German anti-tank guns positioned in concealed firing positions. Soviet tank crews reported difficulty identifying targets in heavy snowfall, while German defenders enjoyed advantages of prepared positions with predetermined fields of fire. German casualty reports from the first day indicated losses totaling 1,240 killed and 2,190 wounded across the 9th Army's defensive sectors. Soviet casualties proved significantly higher, with preliminary estimates suggesting 8,700 killed and 14,200 wounded during initial assault operations. These casualty ratios reflected German defensive advantages while demonstrating the intensity of combat throughout the salient's perimeter. Communication failures plagued Soviet operations during the opening phase as German artillery destroyed numerous telephone lines and radio stations. The Western Front lost contact with 3 subordinate armies for periods exceeding 4 hours, creating coordination problems that German defenders exploited through localized counterattacks. Soviet commanders resorted to courier communications, creating delays in tactical decision-making that reduced operational effectiveness. Artillery support proved crucial during the first day's engagements, with German counter-battery fire achieving notable success against exposed Soviet gun positions. Wehrmacht artillery destroyed 89 Soviet guns, while damaging communication systems, supporting Red Army fire direction. However, Soviet artillery superiority enabled sustained fire support that suppressed German defensive positions during critical phases of infantry assaults. The evening of November 25th revealed mixed results for Operation Mars's opening day. Soviet forces had achieved tactical penetrations at several points while capturing approximately 1,200 German prisoners and destroying 67 enemy tanks. However, breakthrough objectives remained unfulfilled as German mobile reserves contained major penetrations while inflicting severe casualties on attacking Red Army units. Neither side had achieved decisive tactical advantage despite intensive combat throughout the salient. Soviet air operations during the first day encountered severe limitations due to weather conditions and stronger German air resistance than anticipated. Red Air Force units flew 340 sorties compared to 180 German missions, but cloud cover and snowstorms reduced bombing accuracy while German fighters achieved favorable exchange ratios. Soviet ground attack aircraft claimed destruction of 34 German vehicles while losing 23 planes to anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. German defensive doctrine proved effective during initial Soviet assault waves as prepared positions channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. Wehrmacht defenders utilized interlocking fields of fire and concentrated artillery support to maximize casualty ratios while conserving ammunition and personnel. However, sustained Soviet pressure gradually degraded German defensive capabilities as reserve forces committed to containing breakthrough attempts. Civilian populations in combat zones faced immediate displacement as military operations intensified around inhabited areas. Approximately 3,400 Soviet civilians evacuated villages within the expanding combat zone, while partisan units reported increased German security operations in rear areas. The intensification of combat created humanitarian challenges for both military forces, while civilian displacement complicated supply and communication arrangements. Night operations during November 25-26 involved continued Soviet probing attacks designed to identify German defensive weaknesses while maintaining pressure on Wehrmacht positions. German defenders conducted limited counterattacks aimed at recovering lost positions while disrupting Soviet preparations for renewed assault operations. Both sides utilized the hours of darkness to reorganize units, evacuate casualties, and resupply forward positions. The first day of Operation Mars established tactical patterns that would characterize subsequent engagements. Soviet numerical superiority enabled local breakthroughs, German defensive skill contained major penetrations, and extreme weather conditions complicated operations for both sides. The stage was set for prolonged combat as neither side achieved decisive results during the crucial opening phase of what would become one of the most costly battles on the Eastern Front during winter 1942-1943. The escalation of Operation Mars during November 26-30, 1942 transformed localized breakthrough attempts into sustained offensive operations across the entire Rzhev salient. Marshal Zhukov committed additional reserves totaling 89,000 troops from front-level formations as initial assault waves failed to achieve projected breakthrough objectives. The 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps, with 12,000 personnel, received orders to exploit anticipated penetrations near Belly, while the 6th Tank Corps deployed an additional 89 tanks to support Western Front operations around Sikevka. German reinforcement efforts reflected Colonel General Model's growing concern about Soviet offensive capabilities as multiple penetrations threatened defensive line integrity. Army Group Center transferred the 12th Panzer Division with 14,800 troops and 127 tanks from reserve positions to strengthen 9th Army defensive operations. The Grossdeutschland Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, totaling 890 personnel, deployed to critical sectors where Soviet breakthrough attempts appeared most dangerous to overall defensive stability. Soviet casualties during the escalation phase mounted rapidly as Red Army units encountered increasingly effective German defensive measures. Preliminary reports from November 26-30 indicated 18,400 Soviet soldiers killed and 31,700 wounded across both fronts participating in Operation Mars. The 150th Rifle Division suffered 67% casualties, while the 185th Rifle Division reported losses exceeding 58% of authorized strength. Tank losses reached 347 vehicles destroyed or abandoned during breakthrough attempts against fortified German positions. Weather deterioration significantly impacted military operations as temperatures dropped to -22 degrees Celsius, while snowfall increased to depths averaging 42 centimeters across combat zones. Soviet logistics faced severe challenges, maintaining supply lines to forward units as wheeled vehicles struggled through snow-covered terrain. German defenders adapted more effectively to harsh conditions due to prepared winter positions and superior cold weather equipment availability. The expansion of combat operations created international political tensions as news of intensive fighting near Moscow reached diplomatic circles in London and Washington. British intelligence assessments suggested that Soviet offensive operations might achieve decisive success against German Army Group Center, potentially altering the strategic balance on the Eastern Front. American military observers noted the coordination between Operation Mars and ongoing Stalingrad operations as evidence of improved Soviet strategic planning capabilities. Artillery expenditure during the escalation phase reached unprecedented levels as both sides committed maximum fire support to critical engagements. Soviet artillery units fired 156,000 rounds during November 26-30, depleting 23% of accumulated ammunition stocks while achieving limited tactical results. German counter-battery fire destroyed 127 Soviet guns, but faced ammunition shortages that reduced effectiveness of defensive fire missions by an estimated 18%. The 22nd Army's assault against Olenino represented the most successful Soviet breakthrough during this phase, advancing 12 kilometers through German defensive positions while capturing 890 prisoners and destroying 34 enemy tanks. However, German counterattacks by elements of the 36th Motorized Infantry Division recaptured 8 kilometers of lost territory while inflicting 4,200 casualties on Soviet attacking forces. These tactical reversals demonstrated German ability to contain Soviet penetrations despite initial defensive failures. Medical evacuation systems faced overwhelming demands as casualty rates exceeded planning assumptions for both sides. Soviet medical services treated 23,100 wounded personnel during November 26-30, straining hospital capacity to 156% of normal levels. German medical facilities processed 3,840 casualties while evacuating 2,100 serious cases to rear area hospitals beyond Soviet artillery range. Medical supply shortages affected treatment quality for both sides as intensive combat operations continued. Command and control challenges intensified as communication systems suffered damage from artillery fire and extreme weather conditions. The Kalinin Front lost telephone contact with subordinate armies for cumulative periods totaling 47 hours during November 26-30, creating coordination problems that German defenders exploited. Soviet commanders increasingly relied on radio communications despite security risks, while German forces maintained more reliable communication through hardened installations. Air operations expanded despite weather limitations, as both sides committed additional aircraft to support ground operations. Soviet aviation flew 890 sorties while German aircraft completed 420 missions, with ground attack operations achieving mixed results due to poor visibility conditions. Soviet pilots claimed destruction of 78 German vehicles, while losing 34 aircraft to enemy action and weather-related accidents. German air support proved more effective due to better pilot training and equipment reliability in harsh conditions. The crisis phase of Operation Mars revealed fundamental problems with Soviet operational planning, as breakthrough attempts failed to achieve strategic objectives within projected timeframes. Zhukov requested additional reserves from Stavka while acknowledging that initial casualty estimates had proven unrealistic. Soviet front commanders reported that German defensive capabilities exceeded intelligence assessments, while winter conditions favored defenders more than anticipated. Partisan operations behind German lines intensified during this phase as Soviet irregular forces attempted to disrupt Wehrmacht supply lines and communication systems. Approximately 2,400 partisans operated in rear areas of the salient, conducting 67 attacks against German installations while suffering 290 casualties. German security forces responded with increased patrol activity and reprisal operations against suspected partisan supporters in occupied villages. Tank warfare during the escalation phase demonstrated both Soviet numerical advantages and German tactical superiority in defensive operations. Red Army armor units achieved local penetrations, but suffered disproportionate losses when advancing against prepared anti-tank positions. German panzer units effectively utilized mobile defense tactics while conserving strength for decisive counterattacks against overextended Soviet spearheads. Supply line vulnerability became apparent for both sides as extended combat operations strained logistical capabilities beyond planned parameters. Soviet supply units reported difficulty maintaining adequate ammunition flow to forward units, while German logistics faced challenges distributing reserves across multiple threatened sectors. These supply problems would prove crucial as Operation Mars continued into December, with no decisive results achieved by either side. The escalation phase concluded with both sides committed to prolonged combat operations despite mounting casualties and resource constraints, setting conditions for the climactic battles that would determine Operation Mars' ultimate outcome and influence broader Eastern Front strategic developments throughout the remainder of winter 1942-1943. The peak intensity of Operation Mars occurred during December 1-8, 1942, as Soviet forces launched their final coordinated effort to achieve breakthrough objectives before winter conditions made large-scale offensive operations impossible. Marshal Zhukov committed his remaining reserves, including the 5th Tank Corps with 168 tanks and the 2nd Mechanized Corps, totaling 14,600 personnel, in desperate attempts to salvage strategic objectives from increasingly costly tactical operations. These reinforcements brought total Soviet commitment to 758,000 troops, supported by 1,964 tanks and 24,682 artillery pieces. The largest single engagement of Operation Mars developed around Bailey on December 2nd and 5th, as the 41st Army launched coordinated assaults involving 127,000 troops against German positions defended by elements of 3 Wehrmacht divisions totaling 34,000 personnel. Soviet forces achieved initial penetrations of 8 kilometers while capturing significant portions of the town's defensive perimeter. However, German counterattacks by the 1st Panzer Division and elements of the 36th Motorized Infantry Division restored defensive lines while inflicting 11,400 Soviet casualties during 72 hours of continuous combat. High command decisions during this critical phase reflected growing desperation within Soviet strategic planning as casualties mounted without corresponding territorial gains. Stalin personally intervened on December 4th, ordering Zhukov to continue operations regardless of losses, while threatening replacement if breakthrough objectives remained unachieved. These political pressures complicated military decision-making as Soviet commanders balanced tactical realities against strategic imperatives imposed by the Supreme Command. German defensive operations reached maximum effectiveness during the peak phase as Colonel General Model's tactical innovations demonstrated superiority over Soviet offensive methods. The Ninth Army implemented elastic defense tactics that allowed tactical withdrawals while preserving combat strength for decisive counterattacks. German casualty rates during December 1-8 totaled 2,890 killed and 6,650 wounded, maintaining the favorable exchange ratio that gradually eroded Soviet offensive capabilities despite numerical superiority. Civilian suffering intensified dramatically as combat operations expanded into populated areas previously spared from direct military action. Approximately 12,000 Soviet civilians found themselves trapped in combat zones as military operations encompassed additional villages and towns throughout the salient. German occupation authorities reported 1,240 civilian casualties during December 1st to 8th, while partisan activities resulted in reprisal actions against suspected collaborators and their families. Artillery operations during the peak phase consumed ammunition reserves at unsustainable rates, as both sides committed maximum fire support to decisive engagements. Soviet artillery units expended 189,000 rounds during December 1st to 8th, depleting accumulated stocks to 31% of authorized levels. German artillery fired 67,000 rounds while facing similar supply constraints that reduced defensive fire support effectiveness. Both sides faced difficult decisions about ammunition allocation as supply systems struggled to maintain adequate stockpiles. The most intense fighting occurred around Sikevka during December 6 to 8, as the 20th and 29th Armies launched converging attacks designed to capture this crucial transportation hub. Soviet forces committed 89,000 troops, supported by 267 tanks in coordinated assaults against German positions defended by 23,000 Wehrmacht personnel. Initial Soviet advances of 4 kilometers toward the town center triggered immediate German counterattacks that resulted in tank battles involving over 300 armored vehicles. Soviet tank losses during the peak phase reached catastrophic levels as Red Army armor units encountered increasingly effective German anti-tank defenses organized in depth throughout the salient. Tank casualties during December 1 to 8 totaled 478 vehicles destroyed or abandoned, representing 24% of Soviet armor committed to Operation Mars. The 6th Tank Corps suffered 71% losses, while the 3rd Mechanized Corps reported 63% of its armored vehicles eliminated during breakthrough attempts. Medical systems collapsed under overwhelming casualty loads as combat intensity exceeded all previous planning assumptions. Soviet medical services processed 34,200 wounded personnel during December 1st to 8 while operating at 189% of capacity. German hospitals treated 4,670 casualties while evacuating 2,890 serious cases to facilities beyond Soviet artillery range. Shortages of medical supplies and transportation affected treatment quality for both sides as evacuation systems struggled with unprecedented demands. Weather conditions reached extreme levels during the peak phase, as temperatures dropped to minus 28 degrees Celsius, while blizzard conditions created zero visibility for extended periods. These harsh conditions favored German defenders in prepared positions, while severely hampering Soviet offensive operations requiring movement across open terrain. Frostbite casualties reached 3,400 cases among Soviet forces, compared to 890 among German troops equipped with superior winter clothing and shelter. Air operations during the peak phase demonstrated German tactical superiority despite continued Soviet numerical advantages. Luftwaffe units flew 340 sorties, while Red Air Force aircraft completed 780 missions, but German pilots achieved better results through superior training and equipment reliability. Soviet aviation losses totaled 67 aircraft compared to 23 German planes, while ground support effectiveness remained limited due to weather conditions and German air defenses. The failure of Soviet breakthrough attempts during the peak phase created crisis conditions within Red Army command structures, as tactical objectives remained unachieved despite enormous resource expenditure. Front commanders requested permission to suspend operations, while casualties mounted beyond sustainable levels. Zhukov faced growing pressure from Stalin to demonstrate results while acknowledging that continued operations might result in complete destruction of participating armies. Communication breakdowns during intensive combat operations compromised Soviet coordination, while German defensive communications remained more effective due to hardened installations and backup systems. The Western Front lost contact with subordinate units for periods totaling 89 hours during December 1-8, creating tactical confusion that German commanders exploited through rapid deployment of mobile reserves against isolated Soviet spearheads. Industrial support for Operation Mars revealed limitations in Soviet logistical capabilities as ammunition production failed to replace expenditures, while transportation systems struggled to deliver supplies to combat units. Tank replacement rates averaged 34 vehicles per day compared to losses exceeding 67 daily, creating equipment shortages that reduced offensive effectiveness. German industrial support proved more sustainable despite resource constraints affecting other theaters. The peak phase concluded with Soviet forces achieving minimal territorial gains at enormous cost, while German defensive positions remained essentially intact. Casualty ratios during December 8th reached 4.2.1 in favor of German forces, demonstrating tactical superiority that gradually eroded Soviet offensive potential. The failure to achieve breakthrough during this critical phase effectively doomed Operation Mars, while establishing patterns that would characterize the subsequent withdrawal phase. Soviet resistance to the failure of Operation Mars manifested in desperate tactical adaptations as Red Army commanders struggled to salvage strategic objectives from increasingly hopeless tactical situations. Beginning December 9, 1942, Marshal Zhukov authorized the implementation of experimental assault tactics designed to overcome German defensive superiority through concentrated attacks by specially organized shock groups. These formations, typically consisting of 2,400 infantry supported by 34 tanks and intensive artillery preparation, aimed to achieve localized breakthroughs that conventional assault methods had failed to accomplish. German adaptation to prolonged defensive operations demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility as the Ninth Army developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize Soviet innovations. Colonel General Model implemented rotating defense tactics that allowed exhausted units to recover while fresh formations maintained contact with attacking Soviet forces. German defensive rotations involved 12,000 personnel changes during December 9-15, enabling sustained resistance despite continuous Soviet pressure across multiple sectors of the salient. The psychological toll of extended combat operations became apparent in both armies as casualty rates exceeded anything experienced during previous Eastern Front engagements. Soviet morale reports indicated declining effectiveness in 23 rifle divisions, where losses exceeded 60% of authorized strength. German units reported similar stress indicators, with the 161st Infantry Division experiencing 340 cases of combat exhaustion during December 9-15. Both sides faced challenges maintaining unit cohesion as veteran personnel losses reached critical levels. Innovation in assault tactics emerged from Soviet tactical commanders seeking solutions to persistent breakthrough problems. The 150th Rifle Division developed night infiltration techniques utilizing small groups, advancing through German defensive positions under cover of darkness. These tactics achieved limited success, with Soviet forces penetrating 2 to 3 kilometers into German positions while avoiding detection until dawn revealed their presence. However, German countermeasures quickly contained these penetrations through coordinated counterattacks. Resource management became crucial, as both sides faced ammunition shortages that limited operational capabilities. Soviet artillery commanders implemented rationing measures, reducing fire support to 40 rounds per gun daily compared to previous allocations of 85 rounds. German ammunition conservation measures proved more effective, with Wehrmacht artillery maintaining defensive fire missions while consuming only 28 rounds per gun daily. These supply constraints influenced tactical decisions as commanders balanced firepower requirements against available resources. Improvisation characterized Soviet efforts to maintain offensive pressure despite mounting equipment losses and personnel casualties. Red Army engineers developed expedient bridge construction techniques enabling tank movement across frozen streams and anti-tank obstacles. Soviet forces constructed 47 temporary bridges during December 9-15, though German artillery destroyed 23 of these installations within hours of completion. These engineering efforts demonstrated Soviet determination to continue operations despite tactical setbacks. German defensive innovations included the development of mobile strongpoint tactics that maximized limited personnel while maintaining defensive effectiveness. Wehrmacht units created fortified positions utilizing abandoned Soviet equipment and captured materials to enhance defensive capabilities. The 102nd Infantry Division established 67 such positions during December 9 to 15, creating defensive depth that complicated Soviet assault planning while conserving German manpower for counterattack operations. Medical innovations emerged as both sides adapted treatment procedures to extreme combat conditions and overwhelming casualty loads. Soviet medical personnel developed triage procedures that prioritized treatment based on return-to-duty potential rather than traditional medical criteria. German medical services implemented similar adaptations while maintaining higher treatment standards due to superior supply availability. Medical evacuation effectiveness declined for both sides as transportation assets suffered combat losses. Weather adaptation became essential as December temperatures reached -31 degrees Celsius, with sustained blizzard conditions, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. Soviet forces developed snow camouflage techniques and cold weather assault procedures, while German defenders improved heating systems in fortified positions. Frostbite casualties during December 9-15 totaled 4,200 Soviet cases, compared to 1,100 German instances, reflecting equipment and shelter quality differences between the opposing forces. Partisan operations behind German lines intensified during this phase, as Soviet irregular forces attempted to disrupt Wehrmacht supply systems already strained by prolonged combat operations. Approximately 2,800 partisans conducted 89 attacks during December 9-15, destroying 23 German vehicles and killing 156 personnel. German security responses included deployment of 3,400 troops to rear area operations, reducing frontline strength while achieving limited success against partisan activities. Communication adaptations addressed persistent problems with coordination between Soviet units operating across extended front lines under combat conditions. Red Army signals personnel developed redundant communication networks utilizing multiple radio frequencies and messenger systems. German communication security proved superior due to hardened installations and more reliable equipment, maintaining coordination effectiveness that enabled rapid response to Soviet breakthrough attempts. Tank warfare adaptations reflected lessons learned from catastrophic armored vehicle losses during previous phases of Operation Mars. Soviet armor commanders implemented dispersed attack formations designed to reduce vulnerability to German anti-tank defenses while maintaining breakthrough potential. German anti-tank tactics evolved to emphasize coordinated ambushes utilizing multiple weapon systems positioned in depth throughout defensive zones. Morale fluctuations affected both armies as extended combat operations created psychological stress exceeding previous experience levels. Soviet political officers reported declining enthusiasm for continued attacks among units that had suffered severe casualties without achieving territorial objectives. German morale remained higher due to defensive success, though prolonged combat stress affected individual performance in some Wehrmacht formations. Supply line security became increasingly important as both sides attempted to maintain logistics under combat conditions. Soviet supply convoys faced German artillery interdiction and air attacks, while German logistics dealt with partisan sabotage and Soviet long-range fire. Transportation losses during December 9-15 included 67 Soviet vehicles and 23 German trucks, creating additional strain on already overwhelmed supply systems. Leadership adaptations included changes in tactical command procedures as combat conditions exceeded peacetime training assumptions. Soviet commanders implemented decentralized decision-making procedures, enabling subordinate leaders to respond rapidly to changing tactical situations. German command procedures emphasized coordination between defensive positions while maintaining centralized control over mobile reserves used for counterattack operations. The resistance and adaptation phase demonstrated both sides' determination to achieve objectives despite mounting costs and diminishing prospects for success. These tactical innovations would influence subsequent Eastern Front operations while establishing procedures that both armies would utilize throughout the remainder of the war, regardless of Operation Mars' ultimate outcome in the Rzhev salient. The decisive turning point of Operation Mars occurred during December 11-13, 1942, when accumulated Soviet losses reached levels that made continued offensive operations impossible despite Stalin's political pressure to achieve breakthrough objectives. The crisis began when the 41st Army reported casualties totaling 67,000 personnel, representing 74% of its authorized strength, while remaining combat units could no longer maintain coordinated assault operations against German defensive positions. Marshal Zhukov faced the stark reality that Operation Mars had failed to achieve any strategic objectives while consuming irreplaceable resources needed for other fronts. The collapse of Soviet offensive capability became apparent during failed breakthrough attempts near Sashevka on December 12th, when the 20th Army's final assault, involving 34,000 remaining effective troops, achieved penetrations of only 800 meters before German counterattacks restored original defensive lines. Soviet tank support had dwindled to 89 operational vehicles across both fronts, insufficient to provide meaningful armor assistance for infantry operations. German defenders, though exhausted, maintained tactical superiority that enabled successful defense against increasingly desperate Soviet attacks. German recognition of Soviet offensive exhaustion prompted Colonel General Model to implement limited counterattack operations designed to eliminate remaining Soviet penetrations while improving defensive positions. The 1st Panzer Division, reinforced to 167 operational tanks, launched coordinated attacks on December 13th that recaptured 12 kilometers of territory near Belly, while inflicting an additional 3,400 casualties on defending Soviet forces. These German tactical successes demonstrated the complete reversal of operational momentum that characterized the turning point. Weather conditions during the turning point created additional challenges for both sides, as temperatures dropped to -34 degrees Celsius while sustained blizzards reduced visibility to zero for extended periods. Soviet forces, lacking adequate winter equipment and shelter, suffered 2,800 frostbite casualties during December 11-13, compared to 340 German cases. The extreme conditions favored German defenders in prepared positions while making Soviet movement and coordination virtually impossible across open terrain. The psychological impact of obvious failure affected Soviet unit cohesion, as Red Army personnel recognized that continued operations would result in complete destruction without achieving meaningful results. Reports from political officers indicated declining morale in 31 Soviet divisions, where effective strength had fallen below 40% of authorized levels. Some units reported unauthorized withdrawals and refusal to participate in assault operations, creating disciplinary problems that further reduced operational effectiveness. Medical evacuation systems faced complete breakdown as casualty loads exceeded all transportation and treatment capabilities. Soviet medical services processed 18,900 casualties during December 11-13, while operating without adequate supplies, transportation, or hospital capacity. German medical systems, though strained, maintained functionality due to superior organization and supply availability. Medical personnel from both sides reported unprecedented casualty rates that exceeded combat experience from any previous Eastern Front engagement. Artillery support collapsed for Soviet forces as ammunition exhaustion made sustained fire support impossible during critical phases of combat operations. Red Army artillery units reported ammunition stocks averaging 12% of authorized levels, insufficient for effective fire missions supporting infantry assaults. German artillery maintained defensive fire capabilities despite supply constraints, enabling continued resistance against Soviet breakthrough attempts while conserving resources for future operations. The breakthrough failure at Vazuza on December 12th exemplified Soviet operational collapse, as the 31st Army's assault, involving 18,000 remaining troops, achieved no territorial gains while suffering 1,400 additional casualties. German defensive fire from the 102nd Infantry Division, though limited by ammunition constraints, proved adequate to repel weakened Soviet attacks. This engagement demonstrated that German defensive capabilities remained superior despite months of intensive combat operations. Command decisions during the turning point reflected growing recognition within Soviet leadership that Operation Mars had become unsustainable. Zhukov requested permission to suspend offensive operations while acknowledging that continued attacks would destroy participating armies without achieving strategic objectives. Stalin's initial refusal to authorize withdrawal created additional tension within Soviet command structures as military reality conflicted with political imperatives. Logistics collapse contributed significantly to Soviet operational failure as supply lines proved incapable of supporting extended offensive operations under combat conditions. Transportation losses had reduced Soviet supply capacity to 31% of requirements, while German artillery interdiction prevented adequate resupply of forward units. German logistics, though strained, maintained defensive sustainability that enabled continued resistance against Soviet attacks. Air operations during the turning point demonstrated complete German tactical superiority as Luftwaffe units achieved favorable exchange ratios despite numerical disadvantages. Soviet aviation flew 420 sorties during December 11th and 13, while losing 43 aircraft to German fighters and anti-aircraft fire. German air operations totaled 180 sorties with 8 aircraft losses, maintaining air support for ground forces while disrupting Soviet supply operations. The turning point revealed fundamental flaws in Soviet operational planning that had underestimated German defensive capabilities while overestimating Red Army offensive potential. Intelligence failures regarding German strength, terrain difficulties, and weather impacts had contributed to unrealistic objectives that proved impossible to achieve with available resources. These planning errors resulted in catastrophic losses without corresponding strategic gains. Tank warfare during the turning point demonstrated the complete exhaustion of Soviet armored capabilities, as remaining vehicles proved insufficient for meaningful breakthrough operations. German anti-tank defenses had destroyed 1,278 Soviet tanks since November 25th, representing 75% of Red Army armor committed to Operation Mars. The few remaining Soviet tanks lacked infantry support and ammunition necessary for effective combat operations. Communication failures during the crisis period prevented effective coordination between Soviet units, while German communications remained functional due to hardened installations and superior equipment. Soviet commanders lost contact with subordinate formations for extended periods, creating tactical confusion that German forces exploited through rapid redeployment of defensive reserves. The turning point concluded with Soviet forces incapable of continued offensive operations while German defenders maintained sufficient strength to resist further attacks. This decisive shift in operational momentum would lead directly to Soviet withdrawal preparations as Operation Mars transitioned from failed offensive to costly defensive operation, establishing the preconditions for the eventual Soviet retreat from the Rzhev salient. The aftermath of Operation Mars began on December 15, 1942, when Marshal Zhukov received Stalin's reluctant authorization to suspend offensive operations and prepare defensive positions to hold territorial gains achieved during 3 weeks of costly combat. The directive acknowledged that continued attacks would destroy remaining Soviet forces without achieving strategic objectives, though political considerations prevented immediate withdrawal orders. Soviet forces commenced transition from offensive to defensive operations, while maintaining positions advanced 8 to 15 kilometers into the German salient at enormous cost in personnel and equipment. The immediate consequences of operational failure became apparent as Soviet casualty reports reached Stavka headquarters during December 16 to 20. Preliminary assessments indicated 70,374 Soviet personnel killed and 145,300 wounded during Operation Mars, representing casualty rates of 32% among participating forces. Tank losses totaled 1,847 vehicles destroyed or abandoned, while artillery losses reached 890 guns eliminated through German counter-battery fire and tactical withdrawals. These losses exceeded Soviet casualties during any previous single operation since the German invasion. German assessment of their defensive success revealed the strategic significance of containing Soviet breakthrough attempts while inflicting disproportionate casualties on attacking forces. Wehrmacht losses during Operation Mars totaled approximately 40,000 casualties, including 8,200 killed and 30,800 wounded across the Ninth Army's defensive sectors. German tank losses numbered 423 vehicles, primarily through mechanical breakdown and Soviet artillery fire. These casualty ratios of 3.6.1 in favor of German forces demonstrated tactical superiority that preserved Army Group Center's strategic position. Retreat preparations began covertly on December 18th, as Soviet commanders recognized the impossibility of maintaining advanced positions without adequate supply lines or reserves to resist German counterattacks. The Western and Kalinin fronts organized withdrawal operations designed to preserve remaining equipment while avoiding complete tactical disaster. Soviet engineers prepared demolitions for abandoned positions, while logistics personnel evacuated critical supplies to prevent German capture of valuable materials. Humanitarian crises developed in combat zones as civilian populations faced displacement from areas that had changed hands multiple times during the fighting. Approximately 18,000 Soviet civilians required emergency evacuation from combat areas, while partisan casualties totaled 420 killed and 680 wounded during supporting operations. German occupation authorities reported 1,890 civilian deaths directly attributable to military operations, while indirect casualties from exposure, disease, and malnutrition affected thousands of additional non-combatants. The withdrawal process commenced officially on December 20, 1942, as Soviet forces began systematic evacuation of advanced positions while conducting rearguard actions to prevent German pursuit operations. The 41st Army, reduced to 31,000 effective personnel, conducted fighting withdrawals that preserved unit cohesion while minimizing additional casualties. German forces, exhausted by prolonged defensive operations, pursued Soviet withdrawals with limited effectiveness due to their own personnel and equipment losses. Medical evacuation operations during the withdrawal phase faced unprecedented challenges as wounded personnel required transportation across terrain controlled by German forces or contested by ongoing combat operations. Soviet medical services organized 89 evacuation convoys during December 20th to 25, successfully removing 78,000 wounded personnel while losing 340 medical personnel to German artillery fire and air attacks. German medical facilities processed, captured Soviet wounded while managing their own casualty loads. German exploitation of Soviet withdrawal remained limited due to Ninth Army casualties and equipment losses that prevented aggressive pursuit operations. Colonel General Model ordered tactical advances to restore original defensive lines while avoiding overextension that might create vulnerabilities to Soviet counterattacks. German advances during December 2025 recovered 23 kilometers of territory while capturing 2,340 Soviet prisoners and substantial quantities of abandoned equipment. Equipment losses during the withdrawal exceeded Soviet planning assumptions, as transportation shortages prevented evacuation of damaged but repairable vehicles and artillery pieces. Soviet forces abandoned 340 tanks, 670 artillery pieces, and 1,200 vehicles during the retreat, providing German forces with substantial quantities of captured equipment. However, ammunition shortages and mechanical problems limited German utilization of captured Soviet material for defensive improvements. International implications of Operation Mars's failure influenced broader Allied strategic planning, as news of the costly Soviet defeat reached London and Washington through intelligence channels. British assessments suggested that Soviet offensive capabilities had been seriously degraded, while German defensive strength remained formidable despite months of intensive combat. American military observers noted the contrast between Soviet failure at Rzhev and ongoing success at Stalingrad, highlighting the variable nature of Red Army operational effectiveness. Supply line restoration became crucial as Soviet forces attempted to establish sustainable defensive positions following their withdrawal from advanced positions. Red Army logistics units worked to restore communication lines and supply routes damaged during 3 weeks of intensive combat operations. Soviet supply capacity had been reduced to 43% of pre-operation levels due to transportation losses and infrastructure damage throughout the combat zone. Reprisal operations occurred as German forces reoccupied areas previously held by Soviet forces, with Wehrmacht security units conducting searches for partisan collaborators and Soviet agents. German authorities reported arresting 890 suspected partisan supporters while conducting security sweeps in recaptured villages. Soviet sources documented 340 civilian executions during German reoccupation operations, though verification of specific incidents remained difficult due to ongoing combat conditions. Devastation surveys revealed the extent of physical destruction caused by intensive combat operations across the Rzhev salient during Operation Mars. Approximately 67 villages suffered significant damage, while infrastructure destruction included 23 bridges, 45 kilometers of railroad track, and numerous civilian buildings. Agricultural areas faced contamination from unexploded ordnance and military debris that would affect food production for months following the battle's conclusion. Command changes resulted from Operation Mars's failure as Soviet leadership sought accountability for the costly defeat. Several divisional commanders faced reassignment, while front-level staff officers received criticism for intelligence failures and operational planning deficiencies. Marshal Zhukov retained his position despite the defeat, though his influence within Stavka diminished temporarily as Stalin sought alternative strategic advisors. The final withdrawal phase concluded on December 25, 1942, as Soviet forces established new defensive lines approximately 12 kilometers east of their original positions before Operation Mars commenced. German forces occupied defensive positions similar to those held before the Soviet offensive, though both sides had suffered casualties that significantly reduced their combat effectiveness. The strategic situation in the Rzhev salient remained essentially unchanged, despite 3 weeks of intensive combat that had consumed enormous resources while achieving minimal territorial adjustments for either side. The immediate aftermath demonstrated that Operation Mars had failed completely in achieving its strategic objectives while inflicting devastating losses on Soviet forces that would affect Red Army capabilities for months. The costly defeat provided important lessons about the limitations of Soviet offensive methods, while confirming German defensive superiority under certain tactical conditions, influencing subsequent Eastern Front operations throughout 1943. The historical legacy of Operation Mars emerged as one of the most significant yet underreported Soviet military failures of World War II, overshadowed by the simultaneous success of Operation Uranus at Stalingrad. Modern military historians recognize that the operation's failure demonstrated critical limitations in Soviet operational planning and execution that would influence Red Army development throughout the remainder of the war. The contrast between Mars's catastrophic failure and Uranus's decisive success revealed the variable nature of Soviet military capabilities during the crucial winter of 1942-1943. Long-term consequences of the operation extended far beyond immediate tactical results to influence Soviet strategic thinking about offensive operations against prepared German defensive positions. The casualty ratios of 3.6.1 favoring German forces provided valuable intelligence about Wehrmacht defensive capabilities, while highlighting persistent problems with Red Army assault tactics. These lessons would prove crucial during subsequent operations, as Soviet planners adapted their methods to avoid repeating the tactical errors that had made Operation Mars so costly. Academic analysis of Operation Mars within the broader context of Eastern Front operations reveals systematic problems with Soviet intelligence assessment and operational planning during this period. Marshal Zhukov's staff had underestimated German defensive strength by approximately 25%, while overestimating Soviet breakthrough capabilities given available resources and tactical conditions. These intelligence failures contributed directly to unrealistic operational objectives that proved impossible to achieve with forces allocated to the offensive. Political ramifications within Soviet leadership structures reflected Stalin's growing frustration with military commanders who failed to achieve promised results despite enormous resource expenditure. The operation's failure contributed to increasing centralization of military decision-making as Stalin demanded greater personal control over strategic planning. However, the simultaneous success at Stalingrad prevented wholesale changes in Soviet command structures while demonstrating that Red Army forces could achieve decisive victories under appropriate tactical conditions. Economic analysis reveals that Operation Mars consumed resources equivalent to equipping 15 rifle divisions while achieving no strategic objectives, representing one of the most inefficient Soviet military operations of the war. Tank losses totaled 1,847 vehicles, equivalent to the production output of 3 months from major Soviet tank factories. Artillery losses of 890 guns represented similar industrial capacity, while ammunition expenditure exceeded production from 4 major Soviet ammunition plants during the same period. Comparative military analysis demonstrates that German defensive tactics during Operation Mars influenced Wehrmacht doctrine throughout subsequent Eastern Front operations. Colonel General Model's elastic defense methods became standard procedure for German forces facing Soviet breakthrough attempts. The successful defense validated German emphasis on mobile reserves and defense in depth, while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Wehrmacht tactical methods despite growing Soviet numerical superiority. Cultural memory of Operation Mars differed significantly between Soviet and German historical narratives due to political considerations that emphasized successful operations while minimizing defeats. Soviet military histories largely ignored the operation until the 1990s, focusing instead on Stalingrad success stories. German accounts emphasized defensive achievements while demonstrating Wehrmacht capability to resist Soviet offensives under favorable tactical conditions. This selective memory influenced public understanding of Eastern Front dynamics for decades following the war. Operational lessons derived from Operation Mars influenced Soviet tactical development as Red Army commanders adapted assault methods to overcome German defensive advantages. The failure highlighted the importance of adequate intelligence preparation, realistic objective setting, and proper coordination between different arms of service. These lessons contributed to improved Soviet performance during subsequent operations, including the successful elimination of the Rzhev salient in March 1943. International implications of Operation Mars affected Allied strategic planning as British and American leaders reassessed Soviet military capabilities based on conflicting results from simultaneous operations. The failure demonstrated that Soviet forces remained vulnerable to well-prepared German defenses, while success at Stalingrad confirmed Red Army potential for decisive victories. These mixed results influenced Allied decisions about opening additional fronts and providing military assistance to the Soviet Union. Medical and humanitarian consequences of Operation Mars created lasting impacts on civilian populations throughout the combat zone. Civilian casualties totaling approximately 3,100 deaths represented significant population losses in rural areas already devastated by German occupation policies. Medical infrastructure destruction affected healthcare availability for months following the battle, while unexploded ordnance continued causing casualties long after combat operations concluded. Technological developments emerging from Operation Mars included improvements in Soviet assault tactics and German defensive innovations that influenced subsequent Eastern Front engagements. Soviet forces developed better coordination procedures between infantry, armor, and artillery units, while German defenders refined mobile defense techniques that maximized limited personnel effectiveness against numerically superior attacks. These tactical innovations spread throughout both armies during 1943. Environmental impact of intensive combat operations created lasting damage to agricultural areas and natural resources throughout the Rzhev salient. Soil contamination from explosives and fuel spills affected agricultural productivity, while deforestation from military construction reduced timber resources. These environmental consequences affected local economic recovery for years following the war's conclusion. Commemoration practices for Operation Mars remained limited due to political sensitivities surrounding the defeat until historical reassessment during the post-Soviet period. Memorial sites focused primarily on individual heroism rather than operational outcomes, while avoiding discussion of strategic failures that had characterized the planning and execution. This selective commemoration contrasted sharply with extensive memorialization of successful Soviet operations during the same period. Strategic significance of Operation Mars within the broader Eastern Front campaign demonstrates how tactical failures could influence strategic outcomes through resource expenditure and casualty losses that affected subsequent operations. The operation's failure delayed Soviet offensive capabilities while enabling German forces to maintain defensive positions, threatening Moscow until spring 1943. These strategic consequences extended the war's duration while affecting overall Allied operational planning. Modern military education utilizes Operation Mars as a case study, demonstrating the importance of realistic operational planning, adequate intelligence preparation, and proper resource allocation for complex offensive operations. The operation illustrates how tactical competence must be combined with strategic wisdom to achieve meaningful military results. Contemporary military planners study the operation to understand how technological advantages and numerical superiority cannot overcome fundamental planning deficiencies and tactical errors. The ultimate historical significance of Operation Mars lies in its demonstration that military success requires more than numerical superiority and political determination. The operation's failure provided crucial lessons about the complexity of modern warfare, while highlighting the importance of adequate preparation, realistic objectives, and tactical competence. These lessons influenced subsequent Soviet military development and contributed to eventual Red Army success in later operations, making Operation Mars a crucial learning experience despite its immediate failure.